Hello, welcome to Interdependent Study, our podcast where we engage in the learning and unlearning work for collective liberation. I'm Aaron.
And I'm Damien. Thank you so much for joining us today. Each week, we'll bring something new to the table and discuss our thoughts and feelings about it through the lenses of who we are and where we can go for a more just society.
That is correct. We want Interdependent Study to be a space where we're always learning with one another. And Damien, you are up this week.
I am.
What are you bringing to the table today?
You like to make me laugh before these things start. I have brought a piece from In These Times magazine to the table for us to talk about today, which I'm really excited about. The piece we read is called Black-Palestinian Solidarity in Moments of Crisis and Beyond. It was written by Nashwa Bawab, who is actually an assistant editor over at In These Times. And this piece in particular was published just last month in early October. The piece is actually a wide-ranging interview between Nashwa and four incredible organizers, activists, leaders who are all engaged in some form or fashion of Black Palestinian liberation and solidarity work across the country. So those folks are Eman Abdelhadi, who, as I mentioned last week, wrote a great piece in These Times that we read a couple of months ago. That piece was all about the uncommitted movement's sit-in at the DNC. You remember that? Mm-hmm. The second person is Calvin John Smiley, who wrote the great book Defund: Conversations Toward Abolition, which we read and talked about a little bit ago. The third person, new to me, probably new to you, is Sandra Tamari. She's an organizer and a leader out of St. Louis and the executive director of the Adala Justice Project. And then the last person is James Burch, who directs the Anti-Police Terror Project out in Oakland, California. And so, again, this conversation, this interview was a really wide-ranging one. They talked about Israel's genocidal war in Gaza, as well as their recent beginnings of war in Lebanon. They talk about the upcoming presidential election, or by the time this here podcast is live, the election that just passed, and all of the important movement work surrounding the election and you know, how all of that is so important and needs to continue after the election. And they talk about this notion of international solidarity and how important and necessary it is for our collective liberation. So, yeah, you know, I've been really looking forward to having this conversation. I read this immediately after we recorded our last episode, and I've just been itching to talk about this one with you. So let's get into this. What did you think? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought this was great. I wish it had gone on longer. I wish we could have listened to it.
Oh, my gosh, yeah.
Or watched it or whatever.
Yeah.
I thought it was really excellent. And it opened up really strong with this question from Nashwa Bawab, as you said, was the interviewer for the piece. They said, quote, "We are in a tumultuous time for our movements right now. We are now a year into the genocide facing the people of Gaza, and at the same time, we're seeing Israel trying to escalate into a regional war with Lebanon. We've also just seen Marcellus Williams be killed by the state on death row. With all of this in mind, what do you see as the connections between the Palestinian and the Black struggle?" It's such a great question to set the stage for the conversation, because it names the necropolitics of Israel and connects them directly with the necropolitics of the United States.
Yes.
And creating the pathway for conversation to connect all of the dots of similar experiences between Black folks in the U.S. and Palestinians in Palestine, and thus where the work for solidarity is. And I thought it really set up the conversation nicely, while also setting the stage for, hey, let's start here. Like, this is the stuff that's happening, that's active, that is recent in the case then of Marcellus Williams's execution. And I just thought it was a great way to start the conversation, and led to some really wonderful places that you mentioned a little bit earlier. Wonderful in terms of analysis and in terms of what people shared, not the content necessarily, but you know, all the pieces that you added, talking about the election and international solidarity, what's important, and how all of this stuff is working and has been working for a long time now.
Absolutely. Well, that just makes me think about, you said that that's the opening question that she asks all of the interviewees, and you also mentioned this idea of like, you wish you could have seen it or been in the room or listened. I know part of this was an interview, but it was what we read in These Times was edited down for length. And so it makes me think, is that how she started this interview? Because what a kick-ass question. First question that is. And there's so much in that, as you say, that I think opened the door to this rich conversation that they got to have. And it just showed me like out the gate. Like, I mean, I had no doubts about this, but it showed me out the gate that this was going to be, these are 4 brilliant people doing incredible work. And it made me excited to learn from them. One of the things I have often thought about when we witness injustice here and around the world is the role that violence plays in our society and in our collective psyche, and just how violence is in our society, like how accepted, I should say, violence is in our society. And one of the things that James Burch says at one point in this interview, he says, you know, we're often told the violence that we're seeing isn't actually violence, which that gave me some pause. That's so true, right? And so I always think about this violence, but then there was this conversation that they got to have about this. And one of the things that Calvin John Smiley talked about was the role that movements play in fighting against the state's efforts to engage in and maintain war. And his analysis around violence in particular really resonated with me. So he said this, quote, "Thinking about the recent death of Eman Williams in St. Louis, one of the things that I always find really interesting is how they attempt to distribute violence in what they call a, quote, humane way, right? So the fact is that he was put to death through lethal injection, and so that's the humane way to do it.
Right.
It's in the same framework that we hear Israel on the news saying that they're limiting the amount of civilian casualties. What does that mean when we're seeing entire neighborhoods, entire cities being carpet bombed? This violence is not only destroying individuals, but also whole communities and nations of people. So there's certainly that interconnectedness that folks, particularly folks who've organized and been at the other end of a cop's nightstick or find themselves inside of a jail cell, really understand." And I just thought that was some brilliant analysis and critical analysis around violence and how we've been like conditioned to accept it as part of our life, as part of the system, as part of just like the circle of life that, we have to live. And that's always just boggled my mind, And so I really just appreciated Calvin naming that, and also how connected, or how it connects to how important international solidarity is, like that we can see what's happening. You just mentioned this too, like how we can see what's happening in Israel and connected to what happened with Mr. Williams and his execution. How all of these things are connected pieces and struggles.
Yeah, and I think it's such a good point that he makes that we've just been conditioned to accept it as true, and it's just part of life. Like the whole context upon which the order of law rests is that if we don't follow the order of law as individuals, we receive violence of some kind. So yeah, I think it's an important part. And you started talking about James Burch, and saying that the violence isn't something we always see. So I wanted to talk about that quote and flesh it out a little bit. So he says, quote, "There's the neoliberal strategy of telling us that the violence we're seeing somehow is not what we see. So it's not the Palestinians who are the victims. It is the Israelis who are the victims, and we're mistaken. Or it's actually the police officer who is the victim, and it's Israel feared for its life. The police officer feared for their life. The language overlaps at this point." I thought that was such a key point to make, because you see the parallels, you see the way it overlaps.
Absolutely.
And it's almost a cliche now to talk about 1984 in the context of patterns like this.
Yeah.
But it feels so appropriate.
Right.
It's basically Orwell's concept of doublethink, where the regime in the book convinces people to think two opposing things and holding them as simultaneously true.
Yes.
And we see the way that hierarchical power seeks to protect itself in our society and in Israel by telling us that what we're seeing isn't what we're seeing. We don't know the whole context. It's complicated. You didn't see what happened before they started recording.
Yes.
And on, et cetera. And I think when we really get into our collective power as people in solidarity, then we're believing our own eyes, and we're believing each other, and we're believing what we hear, and we're believing that who the people in power are is who they tell us that they are.
Exactly.
We believe them when they tell us.
Yes.
And I think that that's when we can be in true collective power together as people, and really in opposition to the current systems of the day.
Absolutely. Wow, I love the throwback to 1984. But yeah, that quote has so much power in it and so much wisdom in it, and this idea that, we're mistaken, right, stood out to me. And, we hear time and time again, the tired phrase that police officer feared for their life. And so, of course, they took this person's life. And, that rhetoric is something that we're so tired of hearing. And there are just, it's another reason why we're so invested in the idea of abolition, because these current systems have, as you say, told us and shown us what they are. They're violent systems, right? And this is exactly what they're designed to do.
Which we further learned about more last week with white property, black trespass. The white supremacy is ingrained in every piece of the criminal punishment system.
And some of that even came up in Calvin's book as well. Yeah. So, I mean, I love, I've said this multiple times, I love when all of our media connect to one another. So yeah, such a great analysis there. One of the other things that really stood out to me in this interview, this conversation, was some of Eman Abdelhadi's analysis, and particularly on the election, and even drilling it down a little bit more, particularly on the importance of our discourse and our engagement with one another about important issues that are affecting all of us and all of our world, and the impact that will have on our work. And so Eman says, quote, "I feel like every time I'm on a panel or giving an interview, I come back to this. We can't treat our friends who we disagree with or who have questions or concerns the way we treat our enemies. That's not thinking like an organizer. That's not good politics. That's not how our movement grows. I've come to see that we're not in a place right now to affect the top of the Democratic Party structure or the top of the national election structure right now. But what's really going to matter, the most important thing about this election, is the way we talk about and organize around the election. That's going to shape our movement, potentially for decades to come. And that's what I care about more than whether we get 10,000 people or 100,000 people or a couple million people to vote this way or that way, because we don't have the numbers, frankly, for that to be the end goal." And I appreciated that analysis. And we've talked about this before a little bit, but we can't underestimate how important the conversations we have with our friends and family are, and how important the conversations we have and the work that we do, within our local spheres of influence is. And that reinforces to me the idea that our solidarity is linked and it's interconnected. And so the conversations and the work, even bit by bit, is so important, right? And it's just as important as the election, because it's that work that's building, coalition building, that it's work that is getting folks on board. It's bringing people into what's really happening and what's truly important. And so, it's not to say I think that the election isn't important, as Eman says here, but that other work, that day-to-day, bit-by-bit work is also really important.
Yeah, and I think I'm trying to rank it in my head, because my gut feeling is that the work that people are doing in building collective power with one another and solidarity across movements and all that is more important than the election.
Yeah, okay.
Because I think ultimately that's what gets us the things that we need.
Yes.
Like electing somebody into a position of power, electing somebody into being the president of the United States, they're always going to serve the empire that is the president that is the United States. In that position, they're not necessarily going to serve the people. And I think that people developing the ability and the power to continue to do that is going to be the thing that's really important and really drives the election forward.
Well, one of the other things that reminds me of is some of the conversations we've had here around, doing that work and bringing folks on board, and you're figuring out where you get in, where you fit in. And some folks who get into this work are inspired to run for local office. And we talked about that as a vehicle for making change in your local communities and with the people who matter to you most and the people you understand the most. And so that's another way. And so I think that's a really valid point. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think connected to this, John Burch said something else that I thought was great. He said, quote, "I've seen our movement grow in the tactics we're using, especially in on-the-ground resistance. Over the last several decades in the United States, we had a couple opportunities for people to engage in direct action for the first time. And so since 2016 and then 2020 and now again, many people have had experience in the streets. And I think I hope what we're doing, is learning how to do a better job of gathering the energy and making sure that it doesn't all filter out. I know people are exhausted right now. And how do we make sure that the folks who are coming into the streets now and learning about Black-Palestinian solidarity aren't just doing it in moments of crisis?
Yes.
That we continue to build upon this year in and year out. And I think that's a great quote. I think it builds up sort of what I was saying.
Yes.
I was making a segue without really realizing that I was making it.
Yes.
But I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. How do we continue to evolve our tactics and bring more people into movements? How do we get people to fit in wherever they fit in?
Right.
And give them a place where they can fit in too.
Yes.
I think that's another piece that, as I think about an organization that I'm working with and trying to build, is how do we bring people in and give them a place to be in leadership in some capacity? Because there's an investment there. Then there's a connection to movement, and there's a connection to responsibility and feeling valued and feeling part of something.
Absolutely.
And all of that matters. And I think each wave of mass protests and demonstrations are opportunities to train more people in political education and in organizing tactics and increasing our capacity to resist empire as it currently exists and to build our vision for the future we actually demand. And I think that this is why I think that the work that's happening on the periphery of the election is potentially more important than the actual election itself, because it means that the people who are doing this work outside of the official structures of the election are building power with one another, and they're going to have each other no matter what.
Right. And especially when the dust settles. Yeah, absolutely.
And that is something to build from.
Absolutely.
When elections are over, politicians are done with us, right? For the most part.
Yeah.
But if we're doing this work outside and we're trying to live in our values and we're choosing the person who we know is going to sit in this position and give us a better ground to fight upon, fight with them upon, that's more important, I think, than like who's in the seat. Potentially that might not be true in the current election and whatever, but I think that's where my head is at in general in most elections.
It makes a lot of sense. And on top of that, all of their analysis in this conversation was just so incredible. But John Burch here, I especially love that he names this idea of like people are exhausted.
Yeah.
And I think what I really appreciated about this quote is this idea that people are working and responding in times of crisis. And when you're doing that, like when something happens and people have to respond to it, I think that can be really demoralizing, right? That like the action that we're responding to can be demoralizing, and it's difficult and it's hard to fight through. And so I think part of his point here is if we're engaged in this work and building upon the work that's already happened and we're in community with one another and we're doing that coalition building work, it makes it a little bit easier. It makes it a little less exhausting. It's still exhausting, but you're also working to, as you say, with the organization you're working with, and other people are doing this too, you're bringing others involved into the loop. And that is, I think that brings some energy and is exciting to do. And so I just thought there was a lot in that quote. There's so much there to sort of break down and to really think about what's happening in the world and where people are and what's really necessary. So I love that. And I actually think that's a really great segue to application, if I can take us there. So the application portion of our show is where we talk about how this piece and our conversation about it apply to our everyday lives and work. And I think one of the biggest takeaways from this piece is the connections that exist between Palestinian and Black liberation struggles. And all of the activists who are interviewed in this piece talk about these connections throughout this interview in a variety of ways. So you just mentioned James Burch's great analysis. And I think that is particularly important as we approach Election Day here in the United States. And it's past at this point as folks are listening to this. And so one of the things I pulled for application builds off of that great quote from James Burch. Eman Abdelhadi said, quote, "We have to balance an internationalist framework and analysis with a local set of strategies and tactics that understand our unique position here in the heart of that empire." And you mentioned empire earlier, right? And I think together, both of their analyses are a huge takeaway from this piece. It's not just about reacting in times of crisis or about doing that work in an election year. The learning work has to be ongoing. The fight and movement work for collective liberation has to be an ongoing thing. And we have to build upon that year in and year out. And as you so brilliantly said, we have to continue to bring people into that work. So that to me was what I was thinking about for application, what I want to take away from this piece. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly. And I think an extra element to add to it is that when you're building in between the moments of crisis, you're also building to bring more people in during those moments of crisis.
Yes.
And hang on to them in a way, to invite them into the work differently, inviting them in to be more and to be an organizer in that work than simply signing a petition or showing up to a demonstration, but inviting them to continue to be in the work in a more central way.
Yes.
To the work. And I think you're doing that work in between the moments of crisis so that during the moments of crisis you can build out and you have the structure, you have the ability to bring more people into
Absolutely.
the work. So wholeheartedly agree with all of that. Eman Abdelhadi talking about organized abandonment in response to the first question is my application this week. So they say, quote, "I've been thinking a lot about Ruth Wilson Gilmore's framework of organized abandonment. I think it's worth noting that over the weekend, we're seeing American cities underwater. We're seeing police guarding grocery stores while people drown in their homes and are unable to access electricity or clean water or food. And at the same time, we're facing a climate emergency here in the United States, a climate emergency that we know affects indigenous communities and Black communities and poor communities more than any other communities. The National Guard is being deployed to the Middle East to bolster this war that Israel has started and is continuing to escalate, and that the United States is fully funding and supporting." And I know I've said something like this before on the podcast, but it's worth repeating because I think it's a lesson we learn over and over again, all of us. And ultimately, I think it leads us to more solidarity and more work.
Yep.
We're all abandoned by this current system unless we're super wealthy or within the political class. We get some crumbs here, some crumbs there, but ultimately this economy, this U.S. government, this empire, our elections, all of it is not built for us. It's not built for regular people. And once we can see that, we can understand that this is a way of having an aristocracy but calling it a meritocracy.
Yes.
And so that's my application, is that organized abandonment, which we've talked about before.
Yeah.
It's another version of necropolitics, as I really enjoy talking about as a framework. It's all there. It's all applying to our lives every day and influencing the choices that we have and the choices that we don't have in front of us.
I have to tell you, I almost texted you when I read that, and I was like, well, let me not text him. And I just won't put it in my notes because I know I would have bet all the money I have, which is not much, that you were going to want to talk about organized abandonment. When I saw that, I was like, Aaron. That's the first thing I asked, Aaron. Here we are. So I'm so glad you brought that.
And let me tell you why you don't have much money to bet on me bringing that.
Exactly.
Because of organized abandonment.
There it is. Way to bring it full circle.
Thank you.
All right, well, let's shift our conversation over to homework. How do we want to continue our learning and unlearning work after we leave this table today? I would definitely love to learn more about the work of the folks engaged in this interview, and particularly James Burch and Sandra Tamari, since this piece introduced me to them for the first time. And so I feel like it would be really great to learn more about the work of Burch's Anti-Police Terror Project and Tamari's Adala Justice Project, and certainly all of the great work and amazing work I'm sure that those organizations are doing in their communities. And so I'm going to check those out and see what I can learn about their work and maybe even bring that to the table for us. What about you?
So in the opening paragraph of this article, there's another article linked called Defunding the Police in the United States is Palestine Work.
Okay.
And so it's a discussion on solidarity with Sandra Tamari and Kuri Peterson-Smith, which was published in Mondoweiss back in June 2020, which highlights again the ways that the project of solidarity between Palestinians and Black folks in the United States is an ongoing long-term project.
Yes.
So I'd love to go back and read that and see what the conversations were like in 2020. And there's references in this article too in the conversation about the connections between Black Lives Matter protesters in St. Louis and Ferguson in 2014 with Palestinians and treating tear gas via Twitter, and all of that stuff. So, and we've talked about that before here. I mentioned it before as well on the show. But yeah, I want to go back and see like what was the context then in 2020, just to learn a little bit more and continue my education there.
That would be fascinating. Absolutely. Yeah. I'm glad you mentioned that because I missed that. So wonderful homework. All right. Well, that's it for our conversation today. Aaron, my friend, you're up next time.
Yes.
What are you bringing to the table in our next episode?
Well, there is a new issue of Hammer and Hope out.
Yes.
Yes, there is. I found the air horn finally.
He was over here searching. I was like, what is he doing over there?
Yeah. So I am bringing all 16 articles from the new issue next week. So buckle down and get to reading.
Wow. Well, as I sit here in a little bit of back pain, I'll have time just to sit and read. That's great.
Exactly. I'm just kidding. I'm going to bring one article.
Okay.
But it's always hard to figure out what to bring when there's a new issue. So since we're recording this episode right now, a few days before Election Day, and we'll record the next one a few days after Election Day.
Yeah.
Who knows if the election will be decided by then. But, we'll actually have a conversation after the Tuesday, November 5th. I thought I'd bring something that's related to the election.
Okay.
So Olufemi Taiwo wrote an article called The Potential Benefits of Direct Democracy and Voting for Policies, Not Personalities.
Wow.
So based on the first few paragraphs that I've read and the title of the article, this really gets into shifting the way our democracy works to directly voting on policy proposals like we do with referenda on ballots across the country. For example, in our county, we voted on whether or not the county should borrow money to engage in several different kinds of public projects like library enhancements, public schools, the community college, public works buildings, all kinds of things. And they were all things that we voted on as county residents. So doing more things like that, I think on the federal level, moving away from representative style democracy, it might be an interesting way to break through some of the highly influential lobbies and the political funders to get more wins for regular people, especially when we know that people like Elon Musk are donating hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up Donald Trump's campaign.
Yes.
Yeah, we're going to talk about this new piece from Olufemi Taiwo and more about direct democracy.
I love that. That's definitely not something I've thought about, like that idea of, how could we maybe vote for policies over people and what could that look like? So I'm fascinated by this piece and looking forward to it. And I'm a little jealous that you got to be the first one to bring something new, bring something from the new edition of Hammer and Hope.
Just lucky timing.
Just lucky timing. That's how it worked out. Yeah. I love it. Well, I'm really looking forward to that. So good choice. Can't wait. All right, folks. So with that, we want to thank you for joining us today. You know what I'm going to ask you to do here, but in case you forgot, please follow, leave a rating and review, share our podcast with the people in your life. Follow us on social media, including Instagram and TikTok. Check us out over on YouTube and sign up and join us on Patreon to get notified about any new things we've got going on behind the scenes.
Thank you so much for listening. And remember, it's not about us, but it is about all of us. And we'll talk to you next week.